The word hit Etta Keene like a bullet she had not seen coming, and she stood in the center of the Dust Creek Sheriff's office with her hands shaking at her sides, and her heart hammering so loud she was certain Frederick Hadley could hear it from across the room. "You knew," she said. Her voice was not loud. It did not need to be. The quiet of it carved through the air between them like a blade finding the softest place to land. "You knew the whole time that Carver's men were watching the stage road, and you said nothing." Frederick did not move from where he stood beside his desk. The afternoon light came through the single dirty window and fell across his face in a way that made him look older than his 31 years. Or maybe it was the expression he wore, something so carefully closed and guarded that it might as well have been a door locked from the inside. The tin star pinned to his vest caught the light for just a moment, and Etta found herself hating that star more than she had ever hated any object in her life. "I knew there was a risk," he said. "A risk." She repeated the word as if tasting something rotten. "3 days ago, I was sitting in that stage coach, Frederick. 3 days ago, I had my trunk packed and my ticket bought, and I was 7 miles outside of this town on my way to the railhead. There were 4 of Carver's riders waiting in the canyon. 4. And you knew the road wasn't safe." Something moved behind his eyes then. Not guilt exactly, because Frederick Hadley had long since burned through whatever guilt he had been born with. It was something older and darker, something that lived below the surface of a man who had stopped letting himself feel things in any clean or uncomplicated way. "You're still here," he said. "No thanks to you." "You're still here," he repeated, and his voice dropped into a register so low it barely crossed the space between them. "And I am aware of exactly how close you came to not being. I am aware of it every single minute of every single day since it happened, Etta." The way he said her name undid something in her chest that she had been very deliberately keeping tied shut for the better part of 8 months. She pressed her lips together and refused to let it show. "Then why didn't you stop me from getting on that stage?" she demanded. "Why didn't you tell me the road was dangerous? Why did you stand right there on that boardwalk and watch me climb up into that coach and say absolutely nothing?" The silence that followed was the kind that filled a room up to the ceiling and left no air for breathing. Frederick looked down at the surface of his desk. There was a coffee cup there, long cold, and a stack of warrants he had not filed in 3 weeks, and a broken deputy's badge that had belonged to a man named Colt Reese who was buried out on the hill behind the Methodist church. He looked at all of those things and he said, very quietly, "Because I thought you leaving was the right thing for you. And I was not willing to be the reason you stayed." Etta stared at him. Outside, a horse moved along the main street of Dust Creek, its hooves throwing up small puffs of red dust. Somewhere further down the block, a door slammed. The ordinary sounds of an ordinary afternoon in an ordinary dying town in the New Mexico Territory in the year 1882. "What did you just say to me?" she whispered. Frederick finally looked up and met her eyes, and what she saw there was the thing she had been trying not to see for 8 months, the thing she had ridden back into this town specifically to confront, the thing that had sat behind his eyes every time she had handed him a plate of food across the counter of her father's dry goods store, every time he had tipped his hat to her on the street, every time she had caught him watching her from the far end of a crowded room. "I said," he told her, "that I stopped caring about this town the day you almost left it." The room went very still, and that was the moment the whole story truly began, though to understand it fully, you had to go back. You had to go back to the beginning of that summer, when the trouble first arrived in Dust Creek, and when Etta Keene first looked at the broken man behind the sheriff's badge and decided, against every reasonable instinct she possessed, to see what was underneath all that wreckage. Dust Creek was not a good town. That was the honest truth of it, and most of the people who lived there would have admitted it to you if you caught them in a candid moment. It sat in the high desert of New Mexico Territory like something that had been dropped there by accident and had never quite figured out how to leave. The main street was unpaved red dirt that turned to boot-sucking mud in the wet season and blowing powder in the dry, and the buildings that lined it had a weathered, half-hearted look, as though they were not entirely committed to remaining upright. There was a general store run by a man named Etta Keene, who had come west after his wife's death and brought with him his daughter Etta, and a stubbornness so legendary that the other merchants quietly resented and privately admired it in equal measure. There was a saloon called the Broken Spur. There was a blacksmith, a livery, a small church, a smaller school, and a doctor who drank too much but still managed to set bones and deliver babies with a steadiness of hand that defied explanation. And there was the sheriff's office, which had burned twice and been rebuilt twice, and which currently housed one sheriff, one deputy, and a population of mice that the sheriff had given up trying to evict. Frederick Hadley had come to Dusk Creek 3 years before Etta did, which put his arrival at 1877, when the town had still held some ambition for itself, and the cattle trade had been brisk enough to keep the saloon busy and the merchants solvent. He had come from the east, from a town in Arkansas that he never spoke about, carrying nothing but a saddle, a horse, a Winchester rifle, and a reputation that had traveled ahead of him like weather before a storm. He had been a lawman in 3 different territories. He had been a scout for the army during the ugliness of the Apache campaigns, a chapter of his life he was not proud of and did not discuss, and one that had given him a working knowledge of the land and its people that no amount of formal education could have replicated. He had been, by multiple accounts, exceptional at his work, and he had paid for that exceptionalism with everything that people who were exceptional at hard things tended to pay for it with. The county seat had offered him the sheriff's position in Dusk Creek because Dusk Creek was a problem town, and they needed a problem solver, and Frederick Hadley was, if nothing else, ruthlessly effective at solving problems. He had solved 3 of them in his first year. He had run out 2 separate cattle rustling operations, tracked down a murderer who had been evading capture for 18 months, and negotiated a peace between a ranching family and a group of Navajo men over a disputed water source that might otherwise have ended in bloodshed. He had done all of this methodically, quietly, and without any apparent need for recognition, and the town had responded with the particular kind of gratitude that frontier communities reserved for the people they simultaneously appreciated and kept at arm's length. They were grateful for what he did. They were not quite sure what to make of who he was. He was not an unfriendly man, precisely. He was courteous when courtesy was called for. He was direct when directness was required. He had a dry, infrequent sense of humor that caught people off guard when it surfaced. But there was a quality to him that kept people from getting close, a stillness that was not peace, a quietness that was not contentment. He had the look of a man who had been through something that he had survived but not recovered from, and people in Dusk Creek, being perceptive in the particular way that people who depend on reading each other for survival tend to be, understood this and left him room accordingly. By 1880, the cattle trade had begun to decline. By 1881, 3 of the town's most substantial merchants had sold up and moved on, following the railroad that was extending its reach through the territory and leaving smaller, less strategically located towns to wither. Dusk Creek was not on the railroad's route. Dusk Creek was, in the estimation of anyone who looked at a map with clear eyes, precisely the kind of town that would not exist in 20 years. This was the town into which Etta Keene arrived in the spring of 1881, 25 years old, with her father's wagon and her father's determination, and absolutely none of her father's peace with the situation. She had not wanted to come west. She had been living in St. Louis, teaching school and making a life that felt, if not extraordinary, at least steady and purposeful. Her father's letter had been brief and to the point, in the way that Etta Keene communicated everything. His business in Dusk Creek was growing, his partner had pulled out. He needed help with the store, and would she come? There had been no question mark at the end of that sentence, which said everything about the nature of Etta Keene's requests. She had come. And on her first full day in Dust Creek, she had walked into the sheriff's office to report that 3 items had gone missing from a crate that arrived with their last shipment, which she suspected had been pilfered during transport. The report was a formality. She did not expect anything to come of it. She had found Frederick Hadley sitting behind his desk with a cup of cold coffee and a map of the territory spread open in front of him, and he had looked up when she came through the door with the attentive, measuring glance of a man who assessed threats for a living. And then something in his expression had shifted, very slightly, into something that was not professional assessment at all. "You must be Amos's daughter," he said. "Etta Keene," she confirmed. "And you are Frederick Hadley." She had told him about the missing items. He had listened without interrupting, asked 2 precise questions, written the report in a clean, careful hand that surprised her somehow, and told her he would look into it. He had, in fact, looked into it and recovered one of the 3 missing items, and the whole business had been thoroughly unremarkable except for one detail that she kept returning to afterward. When she had stood up to leave, he had also stood, and she had caught him, just for a moment, looking at her with an expression that she could not name. It was not romantic longing in any simple sense. It was something more complicated, something that looked like recognition, as though he had been expecting something to arrive and had stopped expecting it, and had then been surprised to find it standing in his office talking about a missing crate of dry goods. She had thought about that expression on the walk back to the store. She had not entirely stopped thinking about it since. The months that followed were a study in almost conversations, in which she and Frederick spoke across a counter or in passing on the street, and she felt the weight of things unsaid pressing against the surface of every ordinary exchange. Almost moments in which she would look up from whatever she was doing and find him already looking at her, and then he would look away with that careful, deliberate quality that told her the looking away was as intentional as the looking. Almost understanding, in which she gathered pieces of information about him the way you gather wildflowers, one at a time, without quite realizing you're building something. She learned that he had a younger brother somewhere back in Arkansas who he sent money to when he could. She learned that he had killed 6 men in the course of his work, not a number he offered, but a number she calculated from fragments of conversation with his deputy, a steady, good-natured young man named Tom Briggs, who spoke of Frederick with the particular mixture of respect and bewilderment that men tended to adopt when discussing someone they admired but could not quite figure out. She learned that he read, which in Dust Creek made him unusual. She learned that he had once, apparently, laughed loud enough at something to draw the attention of an entire crowded saloon, and that this had been so out of character that Tom Briggs still talked about it 2 years later. She also learned about Marcus Carver. Carver was the kind of trouble that announced itself slowly. He had bought land 12 miles east of Dust Creek the previous year, a failed cattle operation that he had purchased for almost nothing, and in the months that followed, he had been expanding his influence with the methodical patience of a man who knew that time was on his side. He was not a rancher. He was, as Frederick explained it to Etta in one of their counter-conversations, a man who had built his wealth through a careful combination of land speculation, intimidation, and the kind of quiet corruption that found the weakest seam in every institution and pushed until something gave. "He wants Dust Creek," Frederick told her. It was a Tuesday in October, 1881, and she was restocking the shelf behind the counter, and he was standing on the other side of it with a list of supplies that he had come to order, and the afternoon light was coming through the store's single front window in long golden bars. "What does a man like that want with a town like this?" she asked. "The stage road," Frederick said, "and the water rights attached to the land the town sits on. He's bought up 2 parcels already on the north side. He's patient. He doesn't need to take anything by force when he can simply wait for people to sell and leave." She turned to look at him. "And what are you doing about it?" The question was direct, and she could see it land on him in a way that was not comfortable. He met her eyes steadily, but there was something behind the steadiness that was tired. "Everything I can," he said, "which is not as much as it ought to be." This was the thing about Frederick Hadley that Etta had been slowly coming to understand. He was not broken in the way that broken men in stories tended to be broken, dramatically, with obvious wounds that called out for a woman's healing. He was broken in a quieter way, in the way of a man who had spent years being effective at a thing that cost him pieces of himself each time, and who had arrived at a point where he could see the cost clearly but not find a way to stop paying it. He did his job. He did it well. He cared about justice in a stripped-down, fundamental way that had nothing to do with sentiment and everything to do with a deep-seated conviction that people deserved to be protected. But somewhere in the course of the years, the town itself, Dust Creek as a living community, as a place that meant something, had become abstract to him. He moved through it like a man doing maintenance on a building he no longer lived in. Etta watched him the way she had watched everything that interested her, with patience and attention and a willingness to sit with uncertainty, and gradually, what she saw became not just interesting but important in a way that made her breath catch. In November, Carver made his first overt move. He sent men into town on a Saturday night, 4 of them, and they went to the Broken Spur and started a fight that spilled into the street and ended with 2 of Tom Briggs's teeth on the ground and a window broken in the dress shop across the way. Frederick had been there before the fight was a minute old. He had separated the parties, arrested 2 of Carver's men, and sent the other 2 back with a message that contained, according to the men who had been close enough to hear it, language that was precise, quiet, and not something that would have been appropriate to repeat in mixed company. The 2 arrested men were held for 3 days, fined, and released, because the law in New Mexico Territory in 1881 was a complicated and frequently insufficient instrument, and Frederick knew its limits as well as he knew its capacities. Carver sent a letter the following week. Etta did not see this letter, but she heard about its contents from Tom Briggs, who was not a discreet man in the way that his employer was. The letter suggested, politely, that Sheriff Hadley might find his position in Dust Creek more comfortable if he were to be somewhat less attentive to the movements of certain privately employed men in the area. Frederick's response to this letter, according to Tom, had consisted of 2 sentences. The second sentence had been a statement of his position on the matter. The first sentence had been a description of what Carver could do with his suggestion. That was also not something that would have been appropriate to repeat in mixed company. December arrived cold and sharp, and Etta's father fell ill with a chest ailment that kept him in bed for most of 2 weeks, and she ran the store alone and discovered in the process that she was good at it in a way that was a surprise to her. She liked the work. She liked the specific physical satisfaction of a well-organized space, of knowing where everything was, of being the person that the people of Dust Creek came to when they needed something. She liked the conversations. She liked the way the store stood at the intersection of the town's life, so that things found their way to her without her having to go looking, including information. She learned in that December that Marcus Carver had been approaching individual property owners with purchase offers. She learned that 2 of them had accepted. She learned that a third, a widow named Margaret Solis, who owned a parcel of land that included one of the only reliable wells in the eastern quarter of town, had refused, and that following her refusal someone had poisoned the well. Margaret Solis had a son who was 8 years old. She was lucky that she had found out before either of them had drunk from it. Etta brought this information to Frederick on a Wednesday afternoon, walking into his office with the particular purposeful quality that people who brought him important information tended to have, and she told him everything she had heard, clearly and in order, and watched him listen with that focused, still attention that was one of the things she had come to find most compelling about him. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How did you come to know all of this?" "People talk to me," she said simply. He looked at her for a long moment. "I know they do," he said, and there was something in his voice that told her this had not gone unnoticed. Etta, I need you to be careful. Carver is not a man who makes exceptions for people who inconvenience him, regardless of who they are. The way he said it was professional. It was the way he would have said it to anyone. But she had been watching him long enough to notice the very small additional quality to the word careful, as though it carried weight beyond the professional, as though the possibility of her being in danger was something that registered with him on a level that the professional register did not quite contain. I'm always careful, she said. I know you are, he said. I'm asking you to be more so. January brought the new year and a fresh set of problems. 2 of Carver's men were found to be moving stolen cattle through the land east of Dusk Creek, and the process of documenting this, building a legal case, and attempting to bring it to the county authorities was an exercise in institutional frustration that Etta watched Frederick navigate with a combination of relentless persistence and barely contained fury. The county seat was not uninterested in the Carver situation. It was simply slow and cautious, and occupied with several other more immediately pressing matters, and the machinery of justice in New Mexico Territory in 1882 moved with a pace that bore no relationship to the urgency of the situations it was meant to address. "They'll come," Tom Briggs told her once when she asked about it. He was not a complex man, Tom, but he was reliably honest. "Eventually. But Frederick says eventually might be too late." The stolen cattle case did eventually produce a warrant in February, but the men named in it had already moved on, which was entirely predictable, and which Frederick had predicted, and which had produced from him a silence that lasted 3 days and worried Tom Briggs considerably. It was in this context, the context of Carver's patient, incremental advance and the law's inadequate response and Frederick's growing, costly frustration with both, that the event happened which changed everything. In early March 1882, Carver's men burned a barn. It belonged to a family named Ortega who had farmed the southern edge of the Dusk Creek territory for 11 years. They lost the barn, 2 horses, and a year's worth of stored grain. The family was not harmed because they had smelled the smoke in time, but what they had lost represented the margin between surviving the year and not. There was no direct evidence connecting the fire to Carver's operation. There never was. That was the particular dark genius of the man. He kept his own hands immaculate. Frederick spent 4 days investigating and arrived at a conclusion he could not prove and could not act on legally, and something in him that had been under strain for a long time seemed, to Etta's watching eyes, to approach a breaking point. She brought food to his office that evening. She had been doing this occasionally all winter, not as a romantic gesture, she told herself, but because it was practical and he frequently forgot to eat when he was in the middle of something difficult, and there was no one else in Dusk Creek who was going to do it. She brought a plate of roasted chicken and bread and a pot of coffee, and she found him sitting not at his desk but at the window, looking out at the dark Main Street with an expression that made her heart do something painful. She set the plate down on his desk without comment and was going to leave, but he said, without turning, "You don't have to keep doing this." "Someone has to," she said. "It's not your responsibility." "No," she agreed. "It's a choice." He turned then and looked at her, and the expression on his face was something she had not seen on it before. Not the closed, careful, professional expression, not the focused attention. Something more open, more vulnerable, more like what he looked like underneath everything he usually wore. "Why?" he asked. She could have made it simple. She could have said something practical and deflecting about neighbors looking out for each other, about good sense in a hard town. But she was Etta Keene, and she had been watching this man for almost a year, and she was tired of almost. "Because you matter," she said, "and because I think someone ought to tell you that." The silence that followed was very long. "Etta," he said finally, and the way he said it was like a door opening, a crack, light spilling through. "You should know that I am not a good choice." "I didn't say you were a choice," she said. "I said you matter." He stared at her. "Eat your dinner, Frederick," she said, and she left. She walked home in the cold March night with her heart beating in a way that was entirely disproportionate to the practical content of the conversation, and she did not sleep particularly well. And in the morning she went to the store and ran the store and did not let herself think about it too much, which was a strategy that worked until approximately noon. When Frederick came in to pick up his monthly supplies and their hands touched briefly, when she passed him a paper-wrapped package, and neither of them looked at the other directly, which was itself a kind of communication. April brought a development that shifted the balance of everything. A traveler passing through Dust Creek brought information, the kind that moved by word of mouth through the territories faster than any newspaper could carry it. There was a federal marshal riding circuit through New Mexico territory, a man named Aldous Webb, who was specifically tasked with looking at land consolidation schemes and the kind of corruption that Marcus Carver represented. He was, according to the word that came through, 6 to 8 weeks out. Frederick brought this information to the town meeting that he had been trying to get the town's remaining leaders to call for 3 months. 14 people attended, in the back room of the general store, which Etta Keene had agreed to host despite his habitual reluctance to involve himself in town politics. Etta was there, keeping the coffee coming, which also gave her reason to be present for the whole conversation. Frederick laid out what he knew about Carver's operation, systematically and clearly, and then he laid out what the arrival of the federal marshal meant. It meant that Carver knew the situation was changing. It meant that whatever moves he had been planning to make in his own time might be accelerated. It meant the next 8 weeks were the most dangerous they had yet faced. The people in that room listened to him with the attention that people give to things that frighten them, and Etta watched their faces and saw, along with the fear, something she had not entirely expected to see. She saw trust, not uniform trust, not uncomplicated trust, but a real, earned recognition that this was a man who knew what he was talking about and who was telling them the truth about their situation. What she also saw was that Frederick himself seemed not to see it, or if he saw it, did not register it as meaningful. He delivered his information and his recommendations with the same professional distance he delivered everything, and when the meeting was over and people stopped to thank him and express their confidence in him, he responded with courteous brevity and extracted himself as soon as was polite. She caught him outside afterward in the cool night air. "They trust you," she said. "They're frightened," he said. "Both things are true," she said. "You can let them both be true." He looked at her with that look she had come to recognize, the one that was calculating something she was not privy to. "You have a way of saying things very simply that aren't simple at all," he said. "Someone has to." A brief thing crossed his face that might in another man in another moment have been a smile. "You said that before. It keeps being true." They stood in the dark for a moment, close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him through the cool air, and then he said quietly, "Marshal Webb's arrival is good news, but Carver knows it too. The next 2 months are going to be dangerous in a way that the last year wasn't." "I understand," she said. "I don't think you should be making deliveries to the office after dark anymore," he said. "I know that's going to sound like you're trying to take care of me." The pause was brief. "Yes. Is that so terrible?" she asked. Another pause longer. "No," he said, "but it is complicated." "Everything worth anything is complicated," she said. She went home. He went back to his office. And the 8 weeks that followed were the most complicated months in the short and difficult history of Dust Creek. Carver accelerated. The moves were careful, deliberate, and covered. A fire at the schoolhouse that was ruled accidental but which Frederick knew was not. A rumor campaign that targeted 2 of the remaining business owners with accusations of debt and dishonesty that were entirely fabricated but which had their intended effect of weakening community trust. And most significantly, a series of incidents on the stage road that made travel between Dust Creek and the outside world both uncertain and, twice, violent. It was during this period that the relationship between Etta and Frederick moved from almost to something that neither of them had formally named, but which both of them were deeply, quietly aware of. It began with a conversation in the back of the store in the second week of April, in which she had asked him directly what he was afraid of, and he had looked at her for a long moment and then said, with the precision of a man who chose words carefully because he had learned what the wrong words cost, "I'm afraid that I have been at this long enough that I have become the kind of person who is better at the work than at everything else." She had thought about this for a moment. What does everything else mean? "Having a life," he said, "caring about a place, caring about a person in a way that is not purely protective." "And do you," she asked, "care about this place?" "I care about its people," he said. "That's close to the same thing." "And do you care about a person?" she asked very quietly. He looked at her with an expression that was so unguarded that it almost hurt to see. "You know I do," he said. It was not a declaration. It was barely even an admission. But it was true, and they both knew it was true, and the knowledge of it sat between them with a warmth that was unlike anything Etta had felt before, different from what she had expected, less dramatic and somehow more real, like a fire that had been burning steadily for a long time rather than one that had suddenly flared. "I care about you too," she told him. He nodded once, as though this confirmed something he had known but not been certain he was allowed to believe. "Etta," he said, "when this is over, I know," she said. "When this is over." And they had left it there because that was the only responsible place to leave it, because Carver was still circling and the marshal was still weeks away and the town was still in danger, and they were both practical people who understood the ordering of priorities. But the knowing changed things. The conversations changed. They were still careful, still appropriate, still contained within the bounds of what the situation required. But beneath all of that was the warm, steady, mutually acknowledged fact of what they were to each other. And Etta found that it made her both braver and more frightened simultaneously, which she had been told was what caring about someone did to you. May arrived, and with it, an escalation. Carver's men began appearing in town more frequently, in ones and twos, making their presence felt without doing anything that gave Frederick clear legal grounds to act. It was intimidation by presence, and it was effective. 3 more families made the decision to sell and leave in the first 2 weeks of May alone. The town felt, to Etta's senses, like something holding its breath. She wrote to her father, who had recovered from his chest ailment but was spending the spring with relatives in Santa Fe on doctor's orders, about what was happening. His letter back was typically Amos, brief, direct, and not what she expected. "Come home for a visit," he wrote. "Come up to Santa Fe for a few weeks. You have been there a year, and you have not had a rest." She had read the letter 3 times, standing at the store counter with the afternoon light in her eyes. The idea of leaving, even temporarily, had lodged itself in her mind like a splinter, small and irritating and impossible to ignore. Not because she wanted to go. She did not want to go, a fact that surprised her with its force when she examined it directly. She wanted to be here. She wanted to be in this store and in this town and in the specific orbit of the specific man who looked at her with those careful, warm, complicated eyes. Dusk Creek had become, against every expectation, the place she wanted to be. But there was another feeling underneath that one, darker and harder to look at. Fear. Not for herself exactly, though she was not immune to it. Fear for what was coming. Fear that the situation would get worse before the marshal arrived. Fear that Frederick, who she had come to understand in the way you understand a complicated landscape after months of walking through it, would do what he had always done, which was absorb the cost of things that should have been shared. It was in this frame of mind that she had made the decision she would later describe as the worst of her life, which was to do something practical and sensible and entirely wrong. She had booked passage on the stage to the railhead, intending to go to Santa Fe for 2 weeks, give her father the reassurance he was asking for, and come back. She had told herself she was not running away. She was being rational. She was giving Frederick space to do his work without the additional complication of managing his feelings for her alongside everything else. She had not told him she was leaving. She had told herself she would write to him from Santa Fe. She had told herself that he would understand. She had been wrong on all counts. The morning of her departure had been a Tuesday in mid-May, warm and windy, the red dust moving in small spirals up the main street. She had her trunk loaded onto the back of the stage, had given the driver her ticket, and had been climbing up to her seat when she had become aware, with the particular awareness that she had developed over many months of paying attention, that Frederick was watching her from the boardwalk outside his office. She had looked at him. He had looked at her. Neither of them had said anything. The driver had called the stage forward, and the horses had moved, and the town had begun to fall behind her, and she had sat with her hands folded in her lap and her jaw set, and told herself this was the right thing. She had been 7 miles out of Dust Creek, in the red-walled canyon that cut through the mesa to the east, when the riders came. There were 4 of them, and they came from both sides of the canyon, and the stage driver pulled up hard on the reins, and the horses screamed, and the whole vehicle lurched to a stop in the middle of the narrow track. Etta had been the only passenger. One of the men, wearing a gray hat and a red neckerchief, had come up to the stage door and opened it with a particular kind of deliberate courtesy that was more frightening than rudeness would have been. "Miss Keene," he said, "Mr. Carver would like a word." She had known with absolute certainty that this was not a conversation she could safely refuse, and that it was also not a conversation she could safely have. She had also known, with the specific and practical part of her mind that took over in emergencies, that she had exactly one option. She had looked the man in the gray hat directly in the eye and said, "I have no business with Mr. Carver." "That's unfortunate," the man said. What happened next was a very bad hour of her life that she later declined to describe in detail to anyone except Frederick, to whom she described it once, quietly and completely, in the first week after her return, so that he would know what had actually happened and would stop imagining things that were worse. Carver's men had not physically harmed her. They had understood that harming her would create a kind of trouble that Carver did not want. What they had done was take her out of the stage, put her on a horse, and ride her to a camp in the hills where Carver himself was waiting. Marcus Carver was 50 years old, gray-haired, well-dressed by frontier standards, and possessed of a calm, measured manner that would have been more reassuring if it had not been so clearly calculated. He had offered her coffee, which she had declined, and had then spent 20 minutes explaining to her, in very polite terms, that her father's store was the last commercially significant property in Dust Creek that he did not already control or have imminent plans to control, and that her father was a sensible man who would, with the right encouragement, understand that selling and moving on was the wise course. He wanted her to be that encouragement. He wanted her to write to her father and advise him to accept the offer that Carver's representative would be delivering to the store in Santa Fe the following week. Etta had listened to all of this with a stillness that she was not feeling on the inside, and then she had said, clearly and directly, that she would not do any such thing, and that she was aware of what Carver had been doing to the people of Dust Creek for the past year, and that she was going to communicate all of it in writing to Federal Marshal Aldous Webb, whose routing schedule she happened to know because Frederick had told her. This had not been the response Carver expected. He had looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man recalculating something, and then he had said, "You are remarkably like your father." "I take that as a compliment," she said. He had, ultimately, let her go, not because she had frightened him, but because holding her would have been legally risky in a way that matched badly with his current timeline. He had made it clear, before she was put back on a horse and pointed toward the stage road, that her cooperation would be remembered, and her lack of it would also be remembered, in the way that people sometimes said things that were not quite threats and not quite promises and were both. She had found the stage driver a mile up the road, waiting nervously, and had ridden back to Dust Creek in a state of cold, focused determination. She had gone straight to Frederick's office, which brought the story back to the moment it had begun, To Etta standing in the middle of the office with her shaking hands and her hammering heart and the word "new" hanging in the air between them. Frederick, after he had said the thing about no longer caring about the town from the day she almost left it, stood looking at her with the door-opening, light-spilling expression, the one she had only seen a handful of times, and she understood, in the way you understand something that you have been circling for a long time and finally stopped running from, what he was actually telling her. "You knew I was leaving," she said, "and you let me go. I thought it was safer," he said. "I thought if you were away from Dusk Creek while the situation with Carver came to a head, you would be out of reach." Yes. And instead Carver's men were waiting on the stage road. "And instead Carver's men were waiting on the stage road," he repeated, "because he knew you were leaving before I did, which means he had someone watching the stage office, which means my plan to keep you safe by sending you away was catastrophically wrong," she said. "Yes." She looked at him for a long moment. "When did you know about the men on the road?" "I found out that evening," he said, "from one of the men Carver has on the edge of town. He comes to me sometimes when Carver's plans go further than he's comfortable with. He told me what Carver had intended and that you had come back on your own, and he stopped." His jaw worked briefly. "I rode out to the canyon at night and I sat there for an hour looking at the marks in the dirt because I needed to understand what had almost happened. What almost happened," she said quietly, "was that I was almost taken out of this place and used as a way to hurt my father and this town." "Yes," he said. "What almost happened was that. And then you couldn't sleep," she said. It was not a question. She knew it was not a question. "I haven't slept properly in 3 weeks," he said, with a directness that surprised her, as though he had decided in this conversation to stop being careful. She crossed the room. She stopped 2 feet from him and looked up at him and said, "Frederick." "Look at me." He looked at her. "I need you to understand something," she said. "I left because I was trying to make things easier for you. I thought I was a complication. I thought that if I were here you would spend energy worrying about me that you needed for other things. I was trying to be sensible and it was completely wrong and I am sorry." Something moved through his expression like wind across still water. "You don't owe me an apology," he said. "I am giving you one anyway," she said. "And I need one in return. Not for not telling me about the road. I understand why you thought what you thought. I need one for the other thing. For spending 8 months looking at me the way you look at me and never once saying the actual words." He was very still. "Because I have been here for a year," she said, "and I have rebuilt myself in this place, and I have decided that this is where I want to be. And I want to be here not just because of this store and this town, though I love them both. I want to be here because you are here, and I am finished pretending that isn't true." Frederick Hadley had been a lawman for 9 years. He had faced men with guns and men with knives and men with the particular cold intention that was more frightening than any weapon. He had faced none of them with the specific quality of presence he brought to the 10 seconds of silence that followed Etta Keene's declaration. Then he reached out and took her hand, just that, just his hand around hers, warm and certain. "I have been afraid," he said, "that caring about things I couldn't protect would break something in me that couldn't be fixed. I have been running that calculus for years. This town, the people in it, you," he paused, "especially you. And," she said. "And I am tired of the calculus," he said. "I stopped caring about this town the day you almost left it, Etta. That's the truth of it. The whole business of Carver and the land and the law and all of it, I would walk away from all of it without a second thought if I thought that was what it took to keep you safe. This town matters to me because you are in it. That is the whole of the math." She was not someone who cried easily. She had cried twice in her adult life before this, both times at funerals. This was not a funeral. This was the opposite of a funeral, but her eyes went very bright. "Say it plainly," she said. "I love you," he said. The words came out without hesitation, as though they had been waiting at the front of him for a long time. "I have loved you since March when you stood in this office and told me I mattered. I have been trying to figure out how to deserve that for 5 months." "You don't earn it," she said. "That's not how it works." "I know," he said. "You've been telling me that in various ways for months and I've been very slow," she laughed. It surprised both of them, the sound of it genuine and sudden and warm. "Yes," she said, "you have been extraordinarily slow." "I can be faster," he said. "Please," she said. And then Frederick Hadley, who had been careful about everything for years, who had measured every action and calculated every cost, and kept himself at a distance from everything that mattered to him as a form of protection, put both his hands on Etta Keene's face and kissed her, and she kissed him back. And the afternoon light came through the dirty window, and the town of Dust Creek went about its ordinary business outside, and neither of them paid any attention to any of it for a while. When she eventually stepped back and looked at him, she said, "Now what?" "Now," he said, "we deal with Carver. And then—" A real smile this time, the one that Tom Briggs had once described as rare enough to draw a crowd. "And then I would very much like to ask your father a question when he returns from Santa Fe." She looked at him steadily. "He'll be back at the end of the month." "Good," Frederick said. "That gives me 3 weeks." "3 weeks for what?" "To earn it," he said. "Frederick." "I know," he said. "I know you said that's not how it works, but let me have 3 weeks. Let me deal with Carver. Let me do my job one more time in a way that I am proud of, and that gives this town a chance to survive. And then let me ask your father properly and start everything that comes after." She considered this. "You are still very slow," she said. "I am working on it," he said. She picked up her bag from where she had set it down. At the door she turned back. "For what it is worth," she said, "I have loved you since March 2, approximately the same day, I think." He was still standing in the middle of his office with both hands at his sides and an expression on his face that she had never seen there before, something open and full and young in a way that his face had not looked young in a long time. "Good," he said. "That makes things simpler. It makes things much more complicated," she said cheerfully, and went home. The following 3 weeks were, in fact, complicated. Marshal Aldous Webb arrived 11 days later, 2 weeks ahead of his anticipated schedule, riding into Dust Creek on a bay horse with 2 deputies behind him, and the specific, road-worn alertness of a man who had been doing his work for a long time, and was still precise about it. He was 55, lean, gray-bearded, and direct, and he and Frederick took to each other with the immediate mutual respect of 2 people who operated by compatible principles. Etta met him at the store on his second day in Dust Creek, when he came in for supplies. She gave him what she had gathered about Carver's operation over the past year, organized and delivered in the same clear, ordered way she had always given information to Frederick, and she watched Webb listen to her with the same quality of focused attention. When she finished, he said, "The sheriff said you were the best source of information in the county." She was pleased by this in a way she tried not to let show on her face. "He said that." "He did," Webb said. "He also said you were involved in the situation in a way that required disclosure." He gave her a measuring look that was not unkind. "He meant that as a compliment to your involvement, not a complication of it." "I know what he meant," she said, and handed Webb his parcel. The legal process against Carver moved, with the marshal's involvement, with a speed that the previous year had made seem impossible. Webb had authority that Frederick did not, and used it without hesitation. Within 5 days of his arrival, he had assembled enough documentation, between what Frederick had gathered and what Etta had provided, and what Tom Briggs had collected in his steadfast, unglamorous way over the preceding months, to proceed. Carver was arrested on a Thursday afternoon in the first week of June. Frederick made the arrest himself, quietly, at Carver's house on the eastern land, with Webb's 2 deputies in attendance and the legal paperwork in order. Carver went without struggle, which Frederick had expected, because Carver was not a physical threat. He was a different kind of danger, the kind that operated through systems and money and patience, and none of those tools were available to him anymore. The men who had gone out to the stage road with Etta were identified through the work of the informant who had been feeding Frederick information for months, a man named John Edgars who had worked for Carver for 2 years and had found his own line beyond which he would not go. Edgar's testimony was substantial, and the men were arrested and held for transport to the federal court at Santa Fe. Dusk Creek, for the first time in longer than most of its residents could clearly remember, exhaled. The relief that moved through the town in the days after Carver's arrest was not triumphant. It was quieter than that, the specific relief of people who had been bracing against something for so long that the removal of it left them temporarily uncertain what to do with their muscles. People came to the store in a different quality of spirit. The conversations had a different texture. Even the light on the main street seemed, to Etta's admittedly subjective perception, different. Frederick came to the store on the Saturday after the arrest, late in the afternoon, after the store was closed and Etta was doing the week's accounting at the counter. He came in through the front door, which she had not locked, and he stood across the counter from her with his hat in his hands and said, without preamble, "I need to say something to you before your father gets back." She set down her pencil and looked at him. "Then say it." "I have been thinking for the past year," he said, "about whether I was the right kind of man for a woman like you. The kind of reasoning being that you are educated and determined and good with people, and capable of making a life anywhere you chose, and that I am a man whose entire skill set involves enforcing order in places where order keeps getting broken, which is not a stable or particularly pleasant occupation." "I am aware of your occupation," she said. "I know you are," he said. "And I've come to believe over the course of the past year and particularly the past 3 weeks that the reasoning was wrong. Not because my occupation is glamorous. It isn't. Not because the work is easy. It's not. But because what matters, what I've learned matters, is not whether I am a comfortable choice. It's whether I am the honest one." She was very still. "Etta," he said, "I am asking you to marry me, formally and plainly. I want to ask your father as well, and I intend to, but I am asking you first because you are the person whose answer matters." She looked at him across the counter of her father's store in the late afternoon light of a June day in Dusk Creek, New Mexico Territory, 1882. "Yes," she said. He smiled, and it was the full, genuine smile, the rare one, and it transformed his face in a way that she intended to spend a very long time looking at. "Yes," she said again, more quietly, coming around the counter to stand in front of him. "Of course, yes. Yes, from the first time you looked at me in this office like you were surprised to find me there. Yes, from every conversation across this counter. Yes, from every plate of food I brought you when you forgot to eat. Absolutely and entirely yes." He took both her hands. "Your father gets back Tuesday. He will want to have a long conversation," she said. "I know. He will ask you a great number of questions about your intentions and your financial situation and your prospects. I know that too. He will approve of you," she said. "Eventually, he is slow like you are." Frederick laughed, real and unguarded. "We'll get along fine then." Amos Keene returned to Dusk Creek on a Tuesday afternoon and walked into his store to find it in excellent order, his inventory well maintained, and his daughter engaged to the sheriff. He had, per his nature, several strong feelings about this simultaneously. He asked Frederick the questions that Etta had predicted, and then several more that she had not, and Frederick answered all of them with the directness and honesty that he brought to everything. And Amos Keene, who was a man who valued directness and honesty above almost all other qualities, had extended his hand at the end of an hour and said, "My wife would have liked you." It was the highest compliment he gave. The wedding was held in September, at the small church in Dusk Creek, on a morning that was still cool from the night's temperature and would be warm by noon. The town turned out for it with an enthusiasm that surprised Frederick and did not surprise Etta, who had spent 2 years understanding the specific love that communities have for events that signify continuation, the statement made by a marriage in a dying town that someone is not leaving, that someone is choosing to build here and stay. Tom Briggs stood up with Frederick and cried openly during the ceremony, which he would deny for years afterward. Margaret Solis, the widow whose well had been poisoned and who had a son named Raphael, had organized the flowers. Even Marshall Webb, who happened to be passing through the territory on circuit, was in attendance, seated in the back pew with his hat on his knee and an expression of quiet satisfaction on his weathered face. Etta wore a dress that she had made herself from fabric she had ordered from a merchant in Santa Fe, cream-colored with small blue flowers at the collar, and she walked down the short aisle of the church on her father's arm with the expression of someone who was exactly where she had chosen to be, which was the most beautiful kind of expression a person could wear. Frederick stood at the front of the church in his one good suit, the tin star absent from his vest for once, and when she came through the door and he saw her, something in his face did the thing it always did when he looked at her, only more so, only without the careful professional guard over it, only completely open and visible to everyone in the room. Tom Briggs started crying before they had exchanged a word. The vows were traditional, spoken in the way of the time and place, and when Frederick said them, he said them in the low, precise voice he used for things he was absolutely certain about, which was its own declaration. Etta said them clearly and without hesitation, because she had never been a person who hesitated about things she had decided. They were married in September 1882, and they moved into the house that Frederick had been living in on the west end of Dusk Creek's Main Street, which was larger than Etta had expected and considerably more Spartan in its furnishings, and which over the following months she transformed without dramatics into a place that was both functional and deeply inhabited, in the way that only people who intend to stay can make a house feel. Frederick continued as sheriff. The departure of Carver and the legal proceedings that followed did not, on their own, reverse the decline of Dusk Creek. The railroad was still not coming. The cattle trade was still thin. People still left. But something had shifted in the town's character, a quality of determination that had not been there before, a recognition that the place was worth fighting for, and this expressed itself in the particular practical ways that people in small towns express collective decisions. Fences got repaired. The church got a new roof. Two of the merchants who had been considering leaving made the decision to stay. Etta Keene expanded the general store, which was as close as he came to making public statements about the future. Frederick, for his part, changed in ways that Etta watched with the same patient attention she had always brought to watching him. He was still quiet. He was still precise and direct and professionally competent in the way that had always defined him. But the specific quality of isolation was gone, replaced by something warmer, something that expressed itself in small and ordinary ways. In the way he sat at the kitchen table in the evenings, relaxed in a fashion she had not seen him relaxed before. In the way he talked about the town with ownership now, with a proprietary feeling that said this is mine and I have chosen it. In the way he laughed more easily, not frequently, but more easily. She loved him for all of it. She loved him for the ways he had always been, and for the ways he was becoming. She loved him for his directness and his care and the specific combination of toughness and gentleness that came out most clearly in the way he dealt with the people of Dusk Creek, who had, over the year following the wedding, moved from keeping him at arm's length to something approaching genuine affection. Tom Briggs told her once, when she was restocking the shelves and he was leaning on the counter waiting for a delivery, "He's different now. Better. Not better at the work, he was always good at the work. Better at the rest of it." "Yes," she said simply. "That's you," Tom said. "That's both of us," she said. In the spring of 1883, 6 months after the wedding, Etta told Frederick that she was expecting their first child. She told him on a Thursday evening at the kitchen table over supper in her direct way. No ceremony, just the fact of it stated plainly, and then she watched his face. The expression that crossed Frederick Hadley's face at that moment was one that she kept with her for the rest of her life. It was not surprise exactly, though there was some of that. It was the expression of a man who had spent years calculating costs and losses, and who had just been handed something that could only be put on the other side of the ledger, something that was entirely and uncomplicatedly good. He reached across the table and took her hand. "Are you well?" he asked. "Very well," she said. "Good," he said, and held her hand for a long moment, and then, I need to fix the front porch before winter." She laughed until she cried, which she had never done before him. He looked puzzled for a moment, and then he understood that this was a good thing, and he smiled, and the evening light came through the kitchen window, and everything was exactly as it should be. The child was born in November of 1883, on a cold morning when the first snow of the season was dusting the red earth outside, which seemed to Etta to be an extremely dramatic timing for someone who had not yet taken a breath. He was a boy born healthy and loud, and they named him James Amos Hadley, the first name for a brother of Frederick's who had died young, the middle name because Amos Keene, when informed of his grandson's arrival via Tom Briggs, who had been dispatched down the street at a near run, had sat down at the counter of his store and put his face in his hands for 2 full minutes, which was, for Amos Keene, an absolute flood of emotion. Frederick held his son for the first time with the same specific combination of precision and gentleness that characterized everything he did, and he looked at the small, squirming, red-faced new person with an expression that Etta could not name because she had never seen it on his face before. It was all plain and simple, the kind that has no calculation in it, only the fact of an entirely new thing that you had not fully understood until it arrived. "Hello," Frederick said to James Amos Hadley very quietly. James scrunched his face and made a small, irritated sound. "Fair enough," Frederick said. Tom Briggs, who was waiting outside the bedroom door and who had been waiting for 3 hours and who had smoked 4 pipes in that time, was let in to see the baby and immediately returned to crying, this time without any subsequent denial. The winter of 1883 was hard in the way that New Mexico Territory winters could be hard, with cold that came in through every gap in the walls and a wind that kept people inside and close. But the house on the west end of Main Street was warm, and it was full in the way that houses become full when they are properly inhabited. And Frederick, who had never had much cause to be home rather than in his office, discovered that he was spending more time at home and finding it the better option more often than he had expected. He and Etta had the kinds of conversations that they had been having for 2 years, but more easily now, more completely, without the weight of things unsaid pressing against the edges. They disagreed about some things because they were both direct and opinionated, and when they disagreed they said so, and then they worked it out, and this process, repeated over months, built something between them that was stronger than agreement would have been. She challenged him on the things she thought he was wrong about. He learned to hear that as something other than criticism. He pushed back when he thought she was misreading a situation. She learned again that he was occasionally right when she had been certain he was wrong, which was an important thing to know about a person. They were, Etta thought in her more reflective moments, 2 people who fit together not in the easy way of people who are perfectly alike, but in the harder and more durable way of people who are genuinely matched, whose different angles shore up each other's weaknesses, whose shared values anchor the places where they differ. In 1884, 2 things happened that changed the nature of Dust Creek's future. The first was the arrival of a new merchant, a man named Chen Wei who had come west on the railroad, and had, after some research, identified Dust Creek as an underserved market with specific opportunities in the importation of goods from the east, and who set up a shop on the north end of Main Street with a business acumen and thoroughness that impressed even Amos Keene, which was not a thing that impressed easily. The second was the announcement that the railroad's secondary line extension would, in fact, pass within 12 miles of Dust Creek, close enough to be reached by a decent connecting road, and that a man with ambition and some capital could establish a transport link between the town and the new stop. Frederick was the first person Etta told when she heard the second piece of news, and he had looked at it with the assessing eye of a man who was good at seeing how things fit together. "The town has a chance," he said. "It always had a chance," she said. "It just needed people to stay long enough to give it one." He looked at her with the specific expression that she had catalogued, the one that said she had, again, found a way to say something simply that was not simple at all. "Yes," he said, "that's exactly right." Tom Briggs, for his part, had met Chen Wei's daughter, a young woman named Lily Wei who was 22 years old, quick-minded, and entirely capable of managing her father's accounts in 3 languages simultaneously, and had within 6 months developed a devotion to her that was both obvious and apparently reciprocated, and which Etta watched with the warm, satisfied interest that people take in the romantic developments of people they care about. Tom had eventually, with a combination of encouragement from Etta and Frederick that was more direct than Tom ever realized, gathered himself and made his feelings known to Lily in a conversation behind the store that Tom later described as the most frightening thing he had ever done, which said something, given that he had been a deputy sheriff for 4 years and had been shot at twice. Lily Wei, for her part, had apparently told Tom that she had been wondering what was taking him so long. In the summer of 1885, Etta found herself expecting their second child, which she told Frederick again at the kitchen table, again on a Thursday evening which seemed, she told him, to be becoming a tradition. "Does Thursday mean something in particular?" he asked. "Apparently we like to have important conversations on Thursday," she said. He considered this. "The day your stage was meant to leave," he said very quietly. She had not thought of that. She looked at him. "You noticed?" "I notice everything," he said. "That is, for better or worse, entirely true." She reached across the table and took his hand this time. They sat there in the kitchen of the house that had become their life, with James sleeping in the next room making small sounds that were either dreams or complaints, with the summer evening coming through the windows, with the sound of Dust Creek settling into its nightly quiet around them. "I am glad you didn't tell me about the road," she said. He looked at her, startled. "If you had told me about the road," she said, "I would not have gotten on the stage. I would not have been taken to Carver. I would not have come back with that specific determination to say every true thing I had been not saying. We would have gone on being very slow about everything for months more, probably, and I have enjoyed these 3 years too much to be comfortable with the idea of them starting later." He was quiet for a moment. "That is a very generous reading of a very large mistake," he said. "It is a practical reading," she said. "You made a mistake and it came out right. That is something that happens sometimes. The important thing is what came after." "What came after," he said, "was the best thing in my life." "Yes," she agreed, "same." Their daughter was born in January of 1886, in the deep cold, and they named her Clara, because Etta had a grandmother named Clara who had been, by all accounts, a woman of considerable force of character and practical competence, and who seemed like an appropriate namesake for a Hadley. Frederick held Clara on her first morning with the same focused tenderness he had brought to holding James, though with a quality to it that was less awe and more recognition, as though the second time he was more present to the specific experience of it. "She looks like you," he said. "She looks like a very new person," Etta said from the bed, with the weary practicality of a woman who had just had a baby. "Both things are true," Frederick said. James, 2 years old and deeply skeptical of the new arrangement, spent 3 days regarding Clara with the suspicious alertness of a person who is not yet sure whether this development is good or bad. And then on the 4th day he sat down next to her and patted her on the head with the careful solemnity of a child who has decided to accept something. And that was that. The years that followed were the years that Etta would look back on when she was much older and describe as the good years. Not because nothing difficult happened, because difficult things always happened, but because of the quality of them, the specific feeling of a life that was fully inhabited, of a place that meant something, of a person beside you who you had chosen, and who had chosen you, and who kept choosing you every day in the small, ordinary ways that were the actual substance of a life together. Frederick served as sheriff of Dust Creek for 7 more years after their wedding. He trained 2 deputies in that time, both of whom went on to their own positions in the expanding territory, and he took a real and unself-conscious pride in that, in the passing on of a particular way of doing the work that he had spent years refining. He dealt with troubles as they came, because troubles always came, though none as sustained or as coordinated as what Carver had represented, and he dealt with them in the way he had always dealt with them, methodically, honestly, and with a fundamental respect for the people he served that had deepened, if anything, over the years. In 1889 he made the decision, after a long conversation with Etta, to step down from the position. He was 38 years old and the work had been good to him, and he had been good at it. But there was other work to be done, and the town had changed in ways that made other things possible. He became the operator of the transport link between Dust Creek and the railroad stop, in partnership with a man named Guillermo Ortega, the son of the family whose barn had been burned, who had grown into a capable and energetic young businessman with a talent for logistics that Frederick recognized immediately. The business was successful. Not extravagantly so, but solidly, sustainably so, in the way of things that are built on good judgment and honest dealing, and a genuine understanding of what people need. Dust Creek, with the railroad connection and the influx of 2 or 3 significant new businesses over the following years, stabilized into something that was not thriving in any grand sense but was genuinely alive, genuinely continuing, genuinely worth the stubbornness of the people who had stayed. Amos Keene handed the store to Etta formally in 1890, when his health began to require more rest and less standing, and she ran it with the same competence she had always run it, with the additions of a new section of dry goods and an expanded credit system for the families who needed it, which was Etta's particular form of pragmatic generosity. Not charity, because people in Dust Creek generally did not want charity, but a structure that made it easier to manage the hard patches without losing dignity. Frederick helped with the accounts on Saturday evenings, at the same kitchen table, with James doing his schoolwork at one end and Clara drawing at the other. And those evenings were so ordinary and so complete that Etta sometimes caught herself in the middle of them, struck by a wave of something that was not quite gratitude and not quite happiness, but was some combination of both that had no other name. On one of those evenings in 1891, Frederick looked up from the account books and looked at her across the table and said, in the way he said important things, quietly and directly and without preamble, "Do you remember what you said to me, the first time you brought food to the office?" She looked up. "I told you that you mattered." "Yes," he said. "And you told me you weren't a good choice," she said. "I did," he said. "I was wrong about that." She smiled at him. "Only slightly," she said. "You are a complicated choice." "But the right one." She looked at him across the table, across the 9 years and the 2 children and the difficult spring and the wedding in September and all the Thursday evenings and the ordinary days that were the substance of everything real. She looked at him and she knew, with the particular deep certainty of someone who has tested a truth against time and found it holds. "The only one," she said. James, 9 years old, looked up from his schoolwork. "Are you two being romantic again?" "Yes," Etta and Frederick said simultaneously, without looking away from each other. James made a sound of theatrical suffering and returned to his mathematics. Clara, 6 years old and considerably more interested in the romantic proceedings, watched them with bright-eyed approval. In 1893, their 3rd child arrived, another boy, whom they named William after Marshall Aldous Webb, who had died the previous year in the performance of his duties and whose obituary in the Santa Fe newspaper had included a line about his work in Dust Creek that had been, Frederick told Etta privately, as accurate a description of what had happened as he had ever read in a newspaper. William Hadley arrived in the world with the considerable energy of a person who had opinions about everything from the beginning, and he grew into a child who was so different from his measured, deliberate father that Etta found it frequently delightful. He was loud, enthusiastic, frequently impractical, and so fundamentally warm that even Frederick, who was not demonstrative by nature, found himself unable to remain unmoved by the specific quality of the child's affection. Tom Briggs and Lily had by this time 2 children of their own, and the Briggs family and the Hadley family had the kind of friendship between them that was less a matter of social choice and more a fact of life, as settled and reliable as the seasons. John Edgars, the man who had given Frederick information about Carver and who had testified against Carver's men, had stayed in Dusk Creek and found work as a ranch hand and later as a hand at the transport business. And he and Frederick had developed the particular relationship of two men who understood each other's complicated histories and did not require any of it to be explained or excused. The Ortega family had rebuilt. Margaret Solis had eventually remarried to Chen Wei, which had been, in the opinion of most of Dusk Creek, an entirely sensible and long overdue development, and her son Raphael had grown into a young man who worked at the general store with a dedication and capability that Etta privately considered equivalent to her own. The school had a new building by 1892, paid for partly by a county grant, and partly by a fundraising effort that Etta had organized with the specific practical efficiency of a woman who has spent years watching what towns need in order to continue being towns. Frederick had helped build it, along with Guillermo Ortega and Tom Briggs and a dozen other men, over 2 Saturdays in September. He was not a man who made speeches or put his name on things, but when the school opened, with 32 children in it and a teacher who had come from Albuquerque, and who was, in Etta's assessment, excellent, Frederick had stood at the back of the room on opening day with his hand in Etta's, and an expression on his face that was private and satisfied and entirely his own. After the ceremony, walking back along the main street in the September afternoon that was so much like the September afternoon of their wedding that Etta noticed it and said nothing, Frederick had said, "Do you remember saying that the town always had a chance, it just needed people to stay?" "Yes," she said. "You were the person who stayed," he said. This he gestured, a small, uncharacteristic gesture taking in the street and the buildings and the school behind them and everything. "This is significantly because you did not get on that stage." She stopped walking and looked at him. "Frederick," she said, "I came back." "You came back," he agreed. "That is the important part," she said. "Not that I was going, but that I came back." He looked at her for a long moment. "Why did you?" he asked. It was a question he had never asked, not directly, not like this. She thought about it honestly. "Because I realized, sitting in that stage coach heading for the canyon before any of Carver's men appeared, before any of the drama that you have been quietly guilty about for 9 years, that I was wrong about what mattered. I thought I was a complication. I thought removing myself was an act of practicality. But the truth was simpler than that. The truth was that I was running away from the most important thing that had ever happened to me because it frightened me. And I am not someone who runs from things that frighten her." "No," he said, "you are not." "So I came back," she said, "for you, for this." She looked at him steadily. "And it has been exactly as good as I believed it would be, better." He did something then that he rarely did in public, which was to take her face in his hands and kiss her on the forehead, the way he did in private moments, with a tenderness that was so characteristic of the private Frederick, the one that very few people ever saw, that she felt the specific warmth of being seen by someone who saw you completely. "Better," he agreed, very quietly. They walked home together in the September afternoon, in Dusk Creek, New Mexico Territory, in the autumn of 1892, while their children waited at home, and the town they had helped keep alive went about its evening business around them. They walked in the comfortable, companionate silence of people who had nothing left unsaid between them, nothing hidden, no secrets held back and no dark past unexamined, only the clean and sturdy fact of a life chosen and continued and made good by the specific daily decision to keep choosing it. The broken sheriff had said he stopped caring about the town the day she almost left it. But what he had meant, and what she had understood in the long, careful years that followed, was something more precise and more true, that she had become the reason the town mattered, that the caring had not stopped but had transformed, had moved from the abstract professional obligation of a man maintaining order in a place he had no personal stake in, to something entirely different, something rooted and warm and alive in the way that only things you have chosen and loved can be alive. He had cared about Dust Creek because she was in it. He had cared about its people because she cared about them. He had found, through the specific education of loving her and being loved by her, that the town and the work and the life in it were worth the full weight of himself, not just the professional, competent part, but all of it. And she had found, through the equally specific education of loving him and being loved back, that a woman could choose a hard town and a complicated man and a life that asked something of her every day, and that this was not a lesser version of what she had wanted but the fullest version, the most real, the most entirely hers. The evening star came up above the mesa as they walked, bright and early, the way it did in the desert in September, and Frederick noticed it and looked at it for a moment and then looked at Etta beside him. And whatever he might have said he kept to himself, because he was still Frederick Hadley, still a man who said the necessary things precisely and kept the rest interior, except that now the rest was warm and not lonely, and the keeping of it was something she understood and shared. She slipped her hand into his. He held it. They went home to their children and their house and their life in Dust Creek, which was not a grand town and which had never been easy, but which was theirs, and which was, in all the ways that counted, exactly enough.